Imagine waking up every day, not knowing what's in store for you. Your life isn't your own. It's controlled by someone else. You have no say, no freedom, and no choices. You're a slave. Would you survive? In ancient Rome, millions of people faced this reality, living through unimaginable hardship. But what was life really like for these slaves? Could you endure the pain, the fear, and the struggle? Stay with me to learn about the brutal world of a Roman slave, what their days looked like, the horrors they endured, and how they survived, or didn't, in a society built on their suffering. By the end of this video, you'll understand how tough it really was to live as a slave in ancient Rome. And you might even ask yourself, could I survive it? The beginning of slavery in ancient Rome. Slavery was a huge part of Roman life. From the rise of Rome as a small city to its peak as an empire that stretched from Europe to the Middle East, slaves were at the heart of its economy and culture. The Romans didn't just have a few slaves. They had millions. These slaves came from all over the world. Prisoners of war, captured civilians, and even people born into slavery. Some were even brought to Rome through trade. So, how did someone become a slave in ancient Rome? It was brutal. If a Roman army captured a city, they didn't just take treasure, they took people. These captured people were forced to work as slaves, doing everything from farming to serving in households. If you were unlucky enough to be born into slavery, you had no chance to escape. There was no way out for you. The role of a slave in Rome was often determined by where they were. Some slaves worked on farms or in mines. Others worked in homes or as gladiators in the arenas. Their jobs were physically demanding and dangerous, and often these slaves lived in horrible conditions. Life on a Roman farm. Roman farms were huge. They needed many slaves to work the land, plant crops, tend animals, and keep everything running smoothly. These slaves worked long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, doing hard labor with no breaks. The work was grueling, and the sun was relentless. Many slaves on farms had no shelter from the elements and were exposed to heat, rain, and cold. What was even worse was the threat of violence. Roman slave owners didn't treat their workers with care. They punished slaves harshly if they made mistakes or tried to escape. A simple mistake could result in a beating or worse. If slaves tried to run away, they were often hunted down and punished in the most brutal ways, sometimes even killed as a warning to others. But even in these harsh conditions, some slaves did their best to survive. They formed close bonds with others who were in the same situation, supporting each other through the hard times. But in the end, no matter how much they helped each other, they had no control over their own lives. The gladiators, fighting for life. Perhaps one of the most famous types of slaves in ancient Rome were the gladiators. These were slaves who were trained to fight in the arena, an incredibly dangerous job. Gladiators were often prisoners of war or criminals, and their fate was sealed the moment they became a gladiator. The life of a gladiator was brutal. They had to train every day, pushing their bodies to the limit, learning how to fight and use weapons. Training was harsh, and the fear of dying in the arena was constant. Once in the arena, gladiators faced each other in deadly combat, often to the death. Some fought for their freedom, while others fought because they had no choice. Even if a gladiator survived, their life was far from safe. They were always at risk of injury, disease, or death. And if they didn't fight well enough, their masters would punish them. The threat of death in the arena wasn't just about the fights. It was about the fear of being forced to fight again and again, never knowing when it would end. But despite the dangers, some gladiators became famous. They were celebrated in Roman culture, their names known to crowds. They might even be given some rewards, like money or freedom, if they survived long enough. But the price of this fame and fortune was steep, enduring pain, suffering, and risking their lives every day. Slaves in Roman households. Life was a little different for slaves who worked in Roman households. These slaves weren't working on farms or fighting in the arenas. They were performing domestic chores. They cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and took care of children. They might even help with shopping or serve meals to their masters. While life in a household may sound better than working the fields or arenas, it had its own set of dangers. For one, slaves in a household were often seen as personal property, and their masters were sometimes brutal. A house slave's life was still filled with fear, as their master could punish them for anything, from breaking a dish to disobeying orders. Many household slaves had to deal with personal humiliation as well. They were constantly under the watchful eyes of their masters, and they were expected to behave like servants, not as human beings. They could be dismissed at any time and sent to the dangerous, grueling work of the mines or the fields. The treatment of slaves, harsh and unforgiving. Roman society didn't consider slaves as people. They were property, plain and simple. Masters had complete control over their slaves. They could sell them, beat them, or even kill them with little consequence. Some slaves had relatively better living conditions, like those who worked in wealthy homes. But for the most part, being a slave in ancient Rome meant living in fear, pain, and exhaustion every day. Slaves weren't given any rights. They could be punished for things as small as looking at their masters the wrong way, or for not working fast enough. If slaves tried to escape, they were severely punished. Their feet would be shackled, or they would be branded with a hot iron. So they couldn't hide their status as a slave. While some slaves rebelled, even organizing revolts against their masters, most of them didn't have the power or resources to fight back. The famous gladiator Spartacus led a revolt that terrified the Roman Empire, but was crushed in the end, and the surviving rebels were crucified, used as an example of what would happen if a slave dared to rebel. The possibility of freedom. Though life as a Roman slave was cruel, freedom was not impossible. Some slaves were freed by their masters, especially if they had served them well for many years. Freed slaves could become Roman citizens, which was a huge deal at the time. They could even start their own businesses or live free lives. But for most slaves, freedom was a distant dream. The system of slavery was so deeply ingrained in Roman society that very few managed to escape it. Even those who did manage to buy their freedom or escape through other means still faced prejudice and hardship in their new lives. Some slaves, especially those in cities, found a way to make a living for themselves. They might work as craftsmen, doctors, or teachers. However, even though they were free, they were still seen as inferior to freeborn Romans. They often faced discrimination and were considered less important in society. What would you have done? Now, let's step back and think about this. What if you were a slave in ancient Rome? How would you survive? Would you be able to endure the constant fear, the hard labor, and the lack of freedom? Could you fight back like Spartacus? Or would you, like most slaves, spend your life trying to make the best of a horrible situation? The truth is, survival of the Roman slave wasn't about strength or intelligence. It was about luck. Some survived because their masters were kind. Others survived because they were skilled and could use their skills to earn their freedom. But for most, survival meant enduring the pain and suffering day in and day out, never knowing if today might be their last day. In the end, the brutal life of a Roman slave is a harsh reminder of the cost of power, the depths of human suffering, and the resilience of the human spirit. Life as a slave in ancient Rome wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It was a constant battle against oppression, fear, and the crushing weight of an unforgiving society. The stories of Roman slaves, their struggles, their pain, and their moments of fleeting hope reflect the stark realities of a time when human lives were valued only by the labor they could provide. When you think about it, the world of ancient Rome was built on the backs of these slaves. From grand estates to public works, from the fields to the gladiator arenas, slaves were the silent engine that powered Roman society. Yet, their names are mostly lost to history, their individual stories forgotten. Only a few lucky ones, those who were granted freedom or who managed to escape, were able to leave behind a trace. For the majority, life was a continuous fight for survival, often ending in tragedy. Imagine waking up each morning not knowing what the day would hold. For many slaves, it was just another endless stretch of hard labor, physical punishment, or fear of death. Whether you were working in a wealthy Roman household, laboring in the fields under the burning sun, or fighting in the gladiatorial arenas for your life, the pressure was constant. You were always a step away from pain, from danger, and from a life that was never truly yours. The power of life and death was in the hands of your masters, and your future was decided by their whims. But even in such darkness, the human spirit has a way of finding hope. Some slaves manage to gain their freedom, even if only through years of hard work or rare acts of kindness from their masters. Others, like the infamous gladiator Spartacus, rose up against the system, defying the odds in a desperate bid for freedom. These stories, though rare, remind us of the strength and determination that can exist even in the most hopeless of circumstances. Could you have survived such a life? It's impossible to say for sure, but the reality is that survival as a Roman slave depended on countless factors: the nature of your master, your physical abilities, your luck, and sometimes even your cunning. The brutality of the system made it incredibly difficult for most to escape, but the stories of those who did give us a glimpse into the power of the human will. They remind us that no matter how bleak the world may seem, the desire for freedom and dignity can never be fully extinguished. When we look back at history, it's easy to think of ancient Rome as a distant, almost mythical time, filled with emperors, grand buildings, and legendary warriors. But beneath all of that, it was built on the sweat, blood, and suffering of millions of slaves. These men, women, and children may not have been the ones to write the history books, but their lives were the foundation of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. As we reflect on the lives of these forgotten souls, it's important to remember the lessons they teach us about resilience, suffering, and the cost of power. Their stories might be lost to time, but their impact on the world was profound and undeniable. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters. If you've been moved by the story of Roman slaves and want to learn more about history's untold tales, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more engaging videos. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The past is full of stories that deserve to be remembered. Let's uncover more together.